working? Great. So thanks for having me, everyone. Really excited to come and talk to you about some work that I've been doing across the past couple of years. Now, it might not be saving lives quite like Pete's talk was. That's quite a hard act to follow, but hopefully we'll have some practical lessons that you guys can take away from the talk. So what am I going to talk about? What I want to talk about, how do we effectively integrate UX practices into a development-led Agile project? So I want to talk about this. The Agile shift has obviously been a recent trend in terms of the ways we're working in UX development. And for me, this was quite a new way of working. So Agile as a framework is intended for developers. That was the heart of Agile. That's where that was born. And actually, one of the things that we're trying to do a lot at the moment is work out how the practices, the processes that we do as UXers, designers, researchers can fit within that framework. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little tiny bit of context of the work that I've been doing for the past couple of years, just to frame what it is I'm telling you, and then talk through 8 lessons that I've learned from that process. So some things about the people and some things about the processes that we do that need to adjust for this sort of framework. So a little bit of context. What have I been doing to justify me standing here to tell you about this? I've been working for the past 2 years, primarily for an organisation called Innovate UK. For those of you who don't know, Innovate UK is a government body who distribute funding into science and technology projects. So the government turns around and says, hey, we've got £1 million to invest in research in driverless cars. What Innovate UK do is they're the funding system that distributes that. So they launch competitions to which all sorts of teams of businesses apply, and then they assess all of those applications, and out the end of that, they decide who's going to get some funding. So that's kind of the general gist behind Innovate UK. What we were doing in this project was trying to take all of those application, assessment, review, claiming, funding sort of processes all online and out of their quite antiquated systems. So the users we're talking about are applicants, assessors, as well as lots of different internal teams. This project was a government project. So I know a lot of people in the room will have a certain level of familiarity with GDS and their particular frameworks. We were moving through the typical phases of a digital by default government project. So that's starting with an upfront discovery phase, involves researching all those different audiences and the different users of the system, understanding what the pain points are, where they struggle with the current process, and how we can better design a new solution for them. Alpha was the really fun bit. Alpha is the proof of concept stage. So that's where we as designers get to go out and test and try loads of different iterations of the product, take it out, research, test with our audiences, find out what works and what doesn't. And beta, the phase we're currently in at the moment, is the implementation of that solution. So that's where we're now looking at a huge team of developers actually taking those designs that we come up with and putting those into the real world. So that's kind of the size and shape of the project. The team who have been working on that, so it's been a large team involved. At the beta stage at the moment, we're about 45 people directly every day on the team. There's obviously lots more stakeholders, support people, that kind of stuff. This gives you a little sense of just where we're distributed. So as well as being lots of different disciplines brought together in this project, we're also across many locations. So we're here in Bristol, as you know, Nomensa, that's where we are today. Innovate UK themselves are based in Swindon. We're working with development partners up in Sheffield, London, Reading, and our friends Worth are over in The Hague. So lots of the project has been happening both remotely and also co-located. So the way it's been working is that teams cycle on and off spending time in Swindon. So we always try and have a core project team, but if we take that 40-odd people that I talked about working day to day, we have an interchangeable 20 or so of those on site in Swindon. So people are rotating in and out. But so key in terms of the collaborative message of this conference and what we're talking about today is actually looking at how we've been running this project with multiple agencies, civil servants, and spread across all the different locations. So that's kind of just a little bit of context for what it is I'm going to be telling you. But what have we learned, and what can I give you that's quite useful to take away? So I think, as I mentioned, 8 things I want to talk through relating to the people and the processes in terms of how they're delivered. So if we take a look at the people involved in this project first, and a few of the lessons that I think are key in terms of being able to deliver a successful project. So in terms of the team, finding that team dynamic was crucial for us and continues to be throughout the course of the project. Now, getting that team dynamic right isn't just something that happens once at the beginning. If you have a living long-term project, that's going to change. People are going to get more experience within that team. That's going to change the dynamic. You're also going to have new people coming on board, older hands leaving the project, and all of that has to be adjusted for. So first thing I want to say about the team makeup. Your job title doesn't matter as long as your team has the right skills. So particularly for us in the UX world, this is always quite a contentious issue. We all like to have lots of different job titles, argue about what those means, the ins and outs. As Graham was hinting at earlier, actually, the expertise that we have, do we define that narrowly in terms of a job title? Do we treat ourselves as more broad generalists? What I wanted to stress was that what matters is you have people in your team who can deliver the skills that you need. So if we take a look at this as an example, who am I going to be today? So what I've got up here is a list of job titles, all of which I was referred to at some point in this project. So I've been a UX consultant, a user researcher, a UX designer, an interface designer, a service designer, a prototyper, full stack visual unicorn, not quite. But if anyone hasn't seen the random UX job generator, that's quite good fun. Everyone should go away and find themselves a new random job title over the coffee break later. But yeah, UX is ambiguous and difficult to define. And I think particularly when you take the context that we were working in, where you had GDS and the government framework, which comes itself with some kind of predetermined job roles that government projects tend to be looking for. You throw in agencies who like to have their own terms for things, and also anyone else who likes to refer to themselves as different things. It can feel quite complicated. But what is really important is that you all understand how each other work and what each other do. So what was key for us was realizing that actually everyone understood each other much better when we were transparent about the processes. So this team that we brought together at the start of this beta phase of the project weren't individuals who had all ever worked together before. Actually, a lot of the developers that we had on board for the project had never worked with a UX team. They didn't really understand the point of us there. They said, well, we're building software and we know how to build software, so we're going to build it and it looks like this. Actually, taking them along the journey and getting them to see some of the processes that we go through as a UX team was crucial to them understanding how we fit into the bigger picture. One great example, this is Rohir, our lead developer, the first time he ever saw some user testing. So head in hands, he's literally sitting there in our observation lab screaming and going, why can't they just find it? It just works like that. It's really obvious to me. So yeah, I think what's kind of quite key, and I think sometimes I find myself as someone who works in a UX agency, and I'm sure other people experience too, is that we can take it a little bit for granted the basics of what we consider our UX process. Actually, we'll come across wider people in all types of jobs who haven't necessarily understood the basics. When we say we want to go out and research and test and iterate and all that sort of stuff, it's not a given that everyone knows that process. Right, next up, number 2 of 8. We've got don't assume shared knowledge or experience. So the ability to collaborate well as a team of this 40+ individuals is based on our shared commonality. So we need to all have the same understanding and be working towards the same goal effectively to know that we're working the right way. So bringing together, again, the teams of designers, developers, people with all sorts of different backgrounds, some of whom had worked with government before, some of whom had worked on the types of forms we were building before, but none of whom had all worked exactly together in this combination, naturally, had fairly different definitions and understanding of things. So even in this room, I think we'll have a lot of cases where our definitions are different. If we take, for example, this word, prototype. Actually, if we look around this room, we've probably got at least 10 different understandings of what this could mean, as well as kind of countless tools and materials we might use to build those. That's not a conversation I'm going to go into now. That can happen another day. But certainly for the course of our project, these are 4 different things which were all kind of perfectly accurately referred to as prototypes. Now, these can be used as prototypes and can be very effective. But when there's a wider team whose actions were relying on knowing when something is prototyped, actually it's really essential that we have the same definition of that. So for our developers, if we are saying, oh, it's prototyped because I've sketched it, or it's prototyped because it's in Actual and it's in wireframes, or it's prototyped because it's in the front-end code. For them, they need to know, when we say prototype, which stage of that process are they ready to intervene with? So the key point I wanted to make here, fidelity, how you use those words, what you agree on, there's no right way or wrong way. It's just got to be agreed amongst that team. Testing is another example of that. Now, as someone who's kind of been spoiled by working as a UXer, testing for me means usability testing and taking our product into the lab and getting loads of feedback from our audiences. But if you turn around to a testing team, a bunch of QA guys who are going to test the code itself, that's a very different concept. Next step. Nurture a team culture where everyone can be challenged. So if we are building this team where there's a level of mutual respect amongst the individuals, they've started to understand the different skills that everyone offers, we've kind of got rid of some of those job title boundaries and just understood what we can all do within that team. What's key is understanding that nobody's above questioning in terms of the decisions that we're making. So the point of agile teams and their kind of self-organizing ability is that we can make the most of these dynamics rather than impose any sort of hierarchies in terms of how decisions need to get made. Although everyone brings different expertise to the table, there can be a huge amount of value, as we've heard earlier this morning as well, in terms of that diversity, getting different perspectives, different ideas that you might not have thought of otherwise. Certainly, I found this a huge value in this project. So I am the designer. I design things, but actually, there are many other people in the team that I was working with who were capable of providing much better solutions at times than I could. Now, I might have gone down one route and held that up to one of our developers who turned around and went, actually, Vic, have you thought about doing it this way? Because that could be quite successful and it might save us time. Or actually, this is going to be easier to implement. Or actually, that's going to tick something off there because we know that later on we're going to need that functionality somewhere else. So if we do it in this way, that's going to now be reusable. So making the most of everyone in that team. Now, I've talked about being able to challenge others. People come to me, question work that I'm doing, those sorts of iterations. I think it's also important that as UXers, we can go and challenge the work that comes out the other end of it. Now, my belief in this has led me to a particular nickname across the course of this project. It's one I am priding myself on. I'm going to take that with me, I think, beyond just the project itself. I have to keep a really close eye on everything that's coming out of the end of the development process. Now, although it's our job to design things up front, actually, I think what Agile can mean is that the way that gets fragmented and passed through the different elements of the process is that you don't necessarily get to view that overall product move through the development process. So I sit there with a fine-tooth comb every time the development team turn around and say, yeah, we've implemented that thing that you asked for. And what we get is picky Vicky time, which is a whole list of feedback where I go, OK, great, but can we do X, Y, and Z? What I wanted to kind of stress, sure, we've said job titles don't matter, everyone works in a big shared team, you can all learn from each other. But actually, if your job is to be the user-centered person in this team, then the overall responsibility for the experience of that end product is going to fall on your shoulders. Now, it's all well and good that other people have suggested and chipped into that process, but you need to be the one that's keeping an eye on how that ends up. Great, OK. Call each other up on issues. It's important that you can have that in the team. And if your team are anything like mine, they'll find quite inventive ways to let you know when they've had enough of your input for a while. Great. So, last one on the topic of how that team is structured is thinking about yourself and understanding the role that you play across the course of the project. So there's a lot about team dynamics and how people work together, but actually, in terms of how we practice user experience as a skill, you have to be quite self-aware and introspective as we go through. One of the things I want to stress here, just because you know what confirmation bias is, doesn't mean you're immune to it. So as UX people, psychologists, researchers, designers, this is the sort of thing that we'll turn around and say, oh, confirmation bias. We know that if we've designed it, or we're expecting a certain outcome, we go into research with a particular bias that says, I'm expecting or hoping to see that my design has tested well, therefore actually I'm gonna kind of slightly filter out some of that negative stuff and just focus in on the positive bit of it. I had to call myself up on this several times across the course of the project. Great things that we did are, getting other teams of people in. So making sure that you have other support. You can get other people to test your products, so you're not the sole person designing and researching. And just basically, whenever you get too ingrained and stagnated, make sure there's somebody who can get you out of that. So what I had done at one point was actually just ask someone to argue with me on whatever I presented. Now, this is my colleague Robin, who, bless him, he went, really? But you don't like it when I argue with you? And I was thinking, no, really. It's for the benefit of the product here. So when I come and say, I've finished this section, we've designed this process, this bit is done, try and pick holes in it. Come and make sure that I haven't got my blinkers on, which say, I know this too well, and therefore I've come to this particular conclusion. So being too close to the product can obscure your objectivity. I think this is one thing that I felt quite acutely. So we're talking like 2 years now on this project. Sometimes when we conduct work in a traditional agency type manner, where you get a brief, you've got a problem that needs to be solved, you can go away, look at that purely from the perspective of, I like to design the best experiences, and come back to the business and say, here you go, wouldn't it be great if it did this? Now, that can be kind of a fun exercise for UX teams, but doesn't necessarily always incorporate all of the nuances that sit behind that. The benefits of this big agile projects and this way of working in terms of co-location with the client and the full team is that you get to understand all the different contexts in which you're designing for. But what that can mean is that you start to make some of those compromises yourself. So what I mean by that is, I think as UX people, what we really like to do is find solutions that meet everyone's needs, that try and make the best of saying, actually, business wants this, user wants this, I'm going to find the way to work, it can work in the middle. But what I found myself doing was actually, now that I got to know the business, the developers, the teams that well, I was starting to have their own voices in the back of my head whenever I was designing things to begin with. So I designed something and say, actually, no, I know this is going to be quite difficult to implement. Can I come up with another way? Actually, yeah, here we go. I'll sacrifice a bit of that for this. And started to make those trade-offs before I'd even taken this to the team. And actually, it was a crucial thing to try and pull back from, was that the rest of the team are there to do that. There are always going to be people who will give you more of the business input, who will tell you that it's going to take too long to build. You don't need to enforce that for yourself within your own brain. Try and keep that user-centered focus. This was just a little example of what I've been talking about, but actually being the ones who is designing things, testing things, you develop such biases in the all-knowing designer role. So by that I mean the team will come to rely on you as somebody who knows the user, because you know them really well. Now in 2 years, I've gone out and done hundreds of usability tests. I've done loads of field research with them. I've gone out and met loads of these cool, crazy scientists at events. I found out loads about materials that I didn't even know existed by turning up at these crazy briefing events. And as a result, I've got to know this audience very well. And I do have a much clearer sense of how to design for them now than I did a couple of years ago. But that still doesn't mean I get it totally right. And you just want to be careful and watch the team. Don't start to come to rely on you and say, actually, we can cut corners in terms of taking that out to test. Because you know the users so well that it's, you get this right every time, so it's fine. We'll just crack on with it and not make time for that particular activity. Great. So that was my bits about people, about understanding the team dynamic you're working in. A couple of points now about the activities that we do as UXers and how those might change in this particular environment. So, research. Now, this is something that will be bread and butter for any of the UXers in the house. But how you conduct research from this sort of framework does need to change quite dramatically. Now, I know that I'm speaking from my own fairly narrow experience, but certainly in some projects, research is something that you can predict a long time in advance. You know when that's going to be scheduled. You know what you're going to be taking out to research, whether that be what questions you're going to ask, what you want to find out about, or what product it is you're taking out to test. And you can plan that with lengthy timescales, long recruitment periods, to try and meet all the exact demographics that you're trying to get to that screener, that kind of process. Actually, in terms of how Agile projects tend to work, the idea that you don't know what's coming in 2 or 3 weeks' time might be very freeing from a development perspective, where we can say, hey, we can constantly reprioritize, and those goalposts are changing, and every couple of weeks we can redefine what it is that we want to be doing in that next phase. But from a research perspective, that makes life quite hard, particularly when you've got a project like we did, where there were lots of different types of audiences. So when I talked about people who are applying for that particular funding or assessing it, all the different types of internal teams, actually if we change our focus and have to be looking at something for the complex finance analysts of this system, and we decide that that's what we're looking at in 2 weeks' time, that doesn't give us enough lead time to be able to look at it. So that's what I was just saying here. If you don't know what you're going to be designing or building in 3 weeks' time, it can be quite difficult to plan around what it is that you're going to research. Now, what I'd say to this is that you need to learn to be a lot more flexible, or I did, certainly, in terms of the approaches that I'd previously taken to research. Actually, you start to get really inventive about how you're finding those participants. You start to do things like recruitment drives, not for specific dates or testing. Now, by that I mean that we approached a lot of Innovate UK's audiences, got them to fill out some surveys, provide availability, let us know what they were interested in, what they were up to, so that we had kind of pools of people that we knew were already warm and interested in research, so that if we turn around and went, actually this Friday, we could do with talking to a few people, we can pick up the phone and say, hey, you told us a few months ago that you might want to talk to us at some point. How about now? Likewise, making the most of where your users are themselves. So this is us out at a few Innovate UK events that I briefly mentioned. They do these briefing events where a new competition is launched, there's some new funding up for grabs, and all the people that might be interested in applying turn up to basically hear about the process itself and also get to know each other. So it works as a networking event for them too, to find collaborative partners for this process. What we did was actually got into a really nice cycle where we went, you know what, we don't know what it is that we're going to be building, but these events are great ways to meet our audience. So whatever it is that we can take out at that point, that's what we're taking. We're not going to worry about that in advance. We'll see literally what the guys have finished building the day before, and then that bit of the system we'll take out and take it to the audience. Next up, Agile doesn't mean no documentation. Yay, documentation. That's what everyone wants to talk about on a Friday morning. It's not a particularly rock and roll thing to discuss, but working out how you're going to document your work can be crucial to sustaining a long-term team. So I think there's a little bit of a myth, and sometimes is the case that it ends up in terms of UX and Agile projects. It means, yay, we get to bin off those big 80-page research reports where we wrote that participant 2 sneezed at exactly 11:53, all that sort of stuff. It can be a great way to reduce the time that you're spending on detailing the process and having more time to actually do it. But if this is going to be a living system, you need to work under the assumption that there's always going to be people who need to be able to come back and trace and know what you did. So for us, that can be other people coming to it. What if someone leaves the project? What if we don't know how something came into being? Or for your future self, when you're asked to turn around and justify a design decision that you made 6 months ago, actually having something you can call back on and hold up and say, this is why, is really valuable. So we turned our focus to looking at how we document the design decisions that were made. So not what was the research that was done, not exactly how many people did we necessarily speak to at which points, which are always useful, fun stats. Stakeholders love them if you can say we spoke to 172 of this particular persona. But more useful for the team itself and for the ability for the project to keep progressing is knowing how we got to a particular design decision. So we had exactly this question come up. Someone had been on the team, been working on a particular area of the system, and then left the team. And we were left with kind of some prototypes and went, okay, cool, this is what this looks like now, But how did we get here? Was this because the business were driving us in this particular direction? Was it because we've spoken to the audience themselves and they've told us that it needs to work in this way? Was it because the dev team have said, yeah, we actually want to do it this way? You don't know all of that unless you are keeping some sort of document and process itself. So that doesn't mean we want big, hefty research reports at the end of this. This just means that we need to be able to have some way of calling back up our previous decisions. So we moved to a process of saying not what was everything we did and found out, but how did we get here and why? So who told us at what point that it needed to go in this approach from a user perspective, and why isn't this working the way it was? Why did we change it? This next one's particularly key. Make time to keep track of the bigger picture. Now, I'll be honest, this is something that I struggled with fairly personally on this project when I realized that I'd let this slip. Now, the Agile process of breaking work down into small, manageable, estimatable chunks might work really well from a development perspective, but we don't think like that as designers. It's very difficult to make sure you're designing the best overall experience if you're only looking at independent aspects of that at any one time. So trying not to lose the structure and systems thinking which underlies a lot of what we do. Exactly it. When you're focusing on the small chunks, you can lose sight of the overall system. So it's really important to kind of keep trying to ask yourself questions like, how consistent are all these elements of the service? How have all the things that I've looked at, do they relate to one another? Does that work in this system? Actually, in stepping back to the journey level and going, not just from kind of page to page clicking through, does this make sense? But actually in kind of the life cycle of this user of the system. So what's the first time they experience this service? How does that change? How many times do they come back? What experience do they get across each of those different times? And how can we make sure that that is overall still going to be the best experience? Yeah. Does this thing I've just designed make sense in the wider context of the other stuff we designed ages ago? This is basically the fundamental question that we had to keep coming back to. Your designs are going to be a living ecosystem. So as you build one aspect, that goes out into the world, and you continue to grow and build and design around it. Those things that you've learned in the later stages are going to affect what you thought of that initial aspect. Being able to understand the relationship between the newer things, the older things, and actually just because you might get a bit wiser about how we're understanding the system. This was just a little example. I can't see much up there, but the example from our project. This is me when I had a bit of a meltdown day and went, hang on, my navigation is a mess. And when there's no navigation in page apart from calls to action and breadcrumbs, you know that's going to be an issue. So this was me saying, here's our whole system in terms of lots of different screenshots across all different aspects of the service. Where am I saying back? Where am I saying back to the previous page? Where have I got things right aligned? Where have I got things left aligned? And actually just forcing yourself to go through some activities like this to try and make sure you're not creating some sort of Frankenstein's monster where in different aspects of the service, you've got really subtly different inconsistencies going on. What I'd recommend about this, don't take this all on yourself. Make this other people's job too. Just because a UX person has looked at something once doesn't mean its design is fixed and done forever. Actually, we got to a point where we had a great process with some of our front-enders who were kind of acting as my design QA and eyes to say, okay, Vicky, I know you've given me this design that looks like this, but the last time we did this, we didn't use that as the page title, and this looks like the same thing again, just in a slightly different area. And actually having other people who feel it's their responsibility too, to own that responsibility, takes it off you a bit, which is great. It leads to that best product. The very last one that I want to talk about was how we tackle UX debt as a concept. So technical debt is something that will be referred to a lot in Agile teams. We start to see things like our dev teams making time to tackle some of the technical debt that they'd accrued across the course of the project. But actually, UX is no different. Now, we'll make sacrifices in terms of our design decisions, particularly if you're chasing, as we were, an MVP solution where we were saying we need to launch a product into the world to start getting some real people through it and some real feedback. But actually, that concept of MVP means that you start to make decisions where you go, I know this isn't the best it could possibly be. I'm going to put that best solution aside for now and go with this one that's slightly crappy, knowing that later I might come back and have a chance to revisit it. Yeah, that's it. MVP is difficult for designers. Although you can help to make some of those ground level calls in terms of what can we sacrifice, what is non-essential to this process, we need to at least have some understanding of the trajectory of the project. So where are we hoping to take this? How do I design this small bit now that helps it be part of this bigger system eventually? The mystical phase 2. The key point here is that I'm sure many people have had experience of projects where they're told, it's fine, we'll come back to that, phase 2 will happen, and that's where we'll do all the fun stuff. Fight for time for iteration. It's absolutely key to try and get that product out into the world in its best possible form. And actually, if your technical teams can have time in for their technical debt, argue for your UX debt too. That was just a particular example, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip over that. And summarize, and just say, yeah, that's been the 8 things I want to share with you. This is just a little summary of them. So your people, make the most of the skills in the team, don't assume shared knowledge, encourage everyone to question each other, and also be aware of your own biases as a designer. And in terms of the process, prepare a flexible approach to research, document to make your own life easier, not someone else's, work to maintain that bigger picture, and fight for time to make your MVP better. And what that should do is that should lead us to a point where Agile works for a UX team as it does a development team, in that what we actually mean by that is that you have the freedom to adapt the way you're working to best deliver the goals of the project. We're not constrained to particular work packages or deliverables that actually, once you've started the process, you realise aren't the best use of time, but it's what we said would be handed out at the end of it, so it's what we're going to deliver. It's about being able to be flexible and adapt how you're working for that project itself. And that's me done. Thanks.